They were born here on land their ancestors bled into, prayed over, and were buried beneath. And yet, from the moment they took their first breath, the world had already decided they were never meant to live in it. Not openly, not safely, not as equals. This is not a story about strangers. This is a story about Americans, documented, recorded, erased, and once you hear it, you won't be able to forget where it happened. Beneath the familiar soil of the United States lies an archive no one tours, no plaques, no gift shops, just paper trails, whispered family rules, and unmarked graves. Entire bloodlines born on this land were treated like trespassers in their own inheritance. Children learned early which names not to say out loud, which doors not to knock on, which truths could get you killed if spoken after dark. Survival meant silence. Memory became a liability. The official histories talk about freedom in broad strokes. They celebrate beginnings, foundings, victories, amendments. But history is selective. It edits out the people who complicated the story. Families whose existence contradicted the promise. Families who were legally present, biologically rooted, yet socially forbidden. Born into citizenship on paper, but condemned in practice. Not allowed to live as who they were. Records exist. Census lists with entire households crossed out. Birth certificates that never matched death records. Court rulings that quietly reclassified humans into problems. Sometimes it wasn't law, it was custom. A look from the wrong neighbor. A town meeting held without you. A rule everyone knew but no one wrote down. You could be born in the same hospital under the same flag, but the rules of life were different depending on your blood. What makes this story unbearable is not just what was done but how normal it became. Families adapted. Parents trained their children to disappear in plain sight, to change names, to marry strategically, to never ask why their grandparents flinched at sirens or why certain relatives moved away and were never mentioned again. Generational trauma wasn't discussed, it was inherited, and over time, the land itself became an accomplice. Fields where laughter once echoed learned to stay quiet. Houses absorbed secrets into their walls. Cemeteries filled with headstones that told partial truths or none at all. The past didn't vanish, it sank. Tonight, we're opening that archive, slowly, carefully, because these stories weren't buried by accident. They were hidden to protect a myth. And the deeper we go, the clearer it becomes some Americans weren't just denied opportunity. They were denied the right to exist without punishment. They were told they belonged, at least on paper. Birthright, citizenship, family deeds, military service records, tax receipts, proof stacked neatly in filing cabinets. But belonging in America has never been just about paperwork. It has always been about permission. And for certain families, permission was permanently revoked the moment they were recognized. In towns scattered across the country, there were unspoken maps. Streets you didn't walk after sunset, stores you didn't enter unless spoken to first, churches where your presence was tolerated but never embraced. Children absorbed these rules before they could read. It was passed down in tone and posture, in the way a mother's hand tightened around a wrist when a stranger stared too long. Survival depended on understanding the invisible boundaries drawn by fear and resentment. Some families were marked by their blood, mixed lineage, wrong ancestry, descendants of people the nation wanted to forget it had exploited, displaced, or experimented on. Their existence disrupted the clean narrative of progress. So the system didn't always exile them, it contained them, kept them close enough to benefit from their labor, far enough to deny their humanity. Born here, yes, but never meant to be seen. The cruelty wasn't always loud. Often it was administrative. Zoning laws that trapped families in decaying neighborhoods. School districts designed to funnel children into failure before they understood the game was rigged. Doctors who recorded symptoms but dismissed suffering. Judges who smiled politely while handing down sentences that destroyed entire family trees. Violence didn't always require blood. Sometimes it came in the form of policies written in calm, neutral language. And when someone tried to leave, truly leave, there was punishment. Moving too far away without permission from the local power structure could invite retaliation. Property burned, jobs vanished. Relatives suddenly arrested for minor infractions. The message was clear: you may have been born here, but you live here by our tolerance, and tolerance is temporary. What haunts the descendants is not just the pain, but the confusion. Why did grandfathers refuse to talk about their childhoods? Why were certain surnames avoided? Why did entire branches of the family tree feel severed? The silence became its own inheritance. Children grew up sensing danger without understanding its source, like a house built over a fault line that never stops humming. The land remembers, even when people pretend not to. Old neighborhoods raised and renamed. Towns that deny what once happened within their borders. But if you listen closely to oral histories, to marginal notes in ledgers, to stories told only after the second or third drink, you begin to see the pattern. These weren't isolated incidents. They were a system of quiet exclusion designed to make certain lives impossible. And the most disturbing truth, many of these families are still here, living in the shadows of a country that insists it never did this, still born on American soil, still not fully allowed to live. For some families, the moment of realization came suddenly. A knock at the door, a letter stamped with an official seal, a school principal asking questions that felt less like concern and more like inventory. For others, it crept in slowly like a stain spreading through generations. Either way, the message eventually arrived. Your presence is a mistake we haven't corrected yet. In the early 20th century, this wasn't even hidden. Entire bloodlines were classified as undesirable, not criminals, not immigrants, citizens, born here, but deemed unfit to reproduce, to own land, to move freely, to exist without supervision. Local governments compiled lists. Doctors gave opinions that carried the weight of law. Social workers decided which children would be removed, which families would be managed, and which lines would quietly end. The language was clean, scientific, humane, they said. Terms like improvement, protection, public good. But behind those words were forced sterilizations, institutional confinements, and marriages controlled by the state. Men and women woke up in hospitals missing pieces of their future. They were told it was necessary, that it was for everyone's benefit, and they were expected to be grateful for the opportunity to disappear without resistance. What makes this chapter especially disturbing is how ordinary it was. These programs didn't operate in secret basements. They existed in public buildings, funded by taxpayers, endorsed by courts. Neighbors knew, clergy knew, teachers knew. Silence wasn't ignorance, it was agreement. And families learned quickly that protesting only made things worse. Compliance became the last form of control they had. Children grew up watching parents shrink, not physically but spiritually. Dreams narrowed, ambitions felt dangerous. Better to be invisible than targeted. Better to accept the role assigned to you than risk becoming a problem the system needed to solve. Even love became cautious. Marriage choices weighed against genetic suspicion. Parenthood treated like a privilege that could be revoked. The records still exist, filed away under euphemisms and case numbers. You can find them if you know where to look. Notes about temperament, about intelligence measured by biased tests, about families described as persistent issues. Each line of ink represented a future altered without consent. Generations redirected not by fate but by policy. And the aftermath didn't end when the laws changed. Trauma doesn't obey repeal dates. Descendants inherited shame without knowing its origin. Medical distrust, fear of institutions, a sense that something about them was fundamentally wrong, even when no one could say why. The damage outlived the legislation. This wasn't ancient history. Some of the people affected lived long enough to see these practices quietly disavowed, never fully apologized for, rarely taught. Born on American soil, processed by American systems, and systematically prevented from living full American lives. What happened next was not release. It was adaptation. When the doors finally opened, when institutions emptied, when programs were renamed or dissolved, the damage didn't walk out with the survivors. It stayed inside them, and it followed them home. Families reunited, but they didn't recognize each other anymore. Years stolen in silence had reshaped personalities. Fathers returned unable to touch their children. Mothers spoke in fragments, as if full sentences were too dangerous. Some never came back at all, officially listed as transferred, relocated, lost to paperwork. At dinner tables across the country, empty chairs became permanent fixtures, explained away with vague phrases like, wasn't well, or that's just how things were back then. Communities learned to live with ghosts. Even when laws shifted, the attitudes didn't. Towns remembered which families had been problems. Employers remembered surnames. Banks remembered addresses. The stigma didn't need enforcement anymore. It was self-sustaining. A raised eyebrow during an interview. A loan denied without explanation. A school counselor gently discouraging a child from dreaming too big. The message was softer now, but no less clear: stay in your place. Children sensed it early. They learned which parts of themselves drew attention and which kept them safe. Some became hyper-visible, trying to outrun the shame by excelling. Others vanished inward, carrying a quiet belief that they were a mistake someone forgot to erase. Even success felt fragile, like it could be revoked if the wrong file was reopened. And there were files, old ones, locked away but never destroyed: county archives, hospital basements, university collections. Inside them were names that still lived nearby, descendants walking the same streets without knowing their family had once been cataloged as a threat. Sometimes the truth surfaced by accident: a curious student, a distant cousin researching genealogy, a clerk who paused too long on a familiar name. Discovery didn't bring closure. It brought questions no one was prepared to answer. Why silence? Why was this allowed? The hardest part to confront is that there was no single villain, no shadowy figure pulling strings. It was a collaboration between fear and convenience, between prejudice and bureaucracy, between people who believed they were doing good and others who simply didn't care enough to stop it. That's what makes it so easy to repeat. Today, the houses still stand. The hospitals have new wings. The towns celebrate anniversaries without mentioning what had to be erased to make them comfortable. And families carry inherited instincts they can't explain, distrust of authority, fear of doctors, an urge to stay small, trauma disguised as personality. They were born here. Their lives were shaped here. And the country that taught them to disappear still struggles to admit it ever asked them to. By the 5th generation, the story no longer sounded like history. It felt like instinct, a reflex passed down without language. Families didn't say, "This happened to us." They said, "This is just how we are. We don't trust doctors. We don't talk to police. We don't keep records. We don't draw attention." The past had become behavior. This is where the archive grows quiet again, not because the horror ended, but because it became internal. No laws were needed anymore. No institutions. The system had successfully taught families to police themselves, to self-edit, to preemptively limit their own futures before anyone else had to. Some descendants tried to break it. They moved away, changed names, married outside the bloodline, built new identities in cities where no one knew their grandparents' reputations. But trauma has a way of following you even when the paper trail doesn't. Panic attacks with no clear cause, a deep unease around authority, a voice in the back of the mind whispering, "Don't get too comfortable. This country has rules you still don't understand." Others stayed. They became caretakers of the land that hurt them. Same houses, same soil, same graveyards. They lived beside neighbors who had no idea or who knew and chose not to remember. Generations overlapped like sediment. The truth pressed down heavier with time, and then something unsettling happened. The nation began to forget, not accidentally, but conveniently. Textbooks shortened, programs reframed. Words like eugenics and containment softened into abstractions. The people affected were described as footnotes, anomalies, products of their time. Not families, not bloodlines, not you. But forgetting is a privilege, and the descendants didn't get that luxury. They felt the absence every time they tried to explain their fear and were told they were overreacting. Every time they asked about family history and were met with anger or tears. The silence itself became evidence. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Because that's the question no one wants to ask. Not what happened back then, but what survival demanded afterward. How much of yourself would you cut away to protect the people you love? How much truth would you bury to keep your children safe? These families weren't weak. They were trained. Trained by a country that taught them the cost of being fully seen. And the most haunting part is this: many of them never realized they were still obeying rules written long before they were born. The archive doesn't end with documents. It lives in nervous systems, in family dynamics, in the choices people make without knowing why. And until that's acknowledged, the past isn't past at all. There is a moment, sometimes late at night, sometimes triggered by a headline or a familiar phrase, when descendants feel it click. Not all at once, not cleanly. Just a quiet realization that the anxiety they carry didn't start with them, that the fear has a history, and that history was deliberately hidden. This is usually where the digging begins, not out of curiosity but necessity. Medical forms that don't make sense, family trees with entire decades missing, a grandmother who refuses to discuss her mother, a last name that changes spelling every generation as if it's trying to escape itself. What starts as confusion becomes suspicion, and suspicion becomes grief. Because uncovering the truth doesn't feel like vindication. It feels like loss. Loss for the lives that could have been lived. For the versions of themselves that never had a chance to exist. People realize their family didn't just make bad choices. They were cornered, conditioned, pressured into paths that looked voluntary only if you ignored the threat behind them. Some try to bring these stories into the light. They contact archives, universities, local historians. Sometimes they're met with sympathy, more often with resistance. Records are incomplete, files are sealed, access requires permissions that never come, or worse, there's denial. That wasn't widespread. That's not how it happened here. You're misunderstanding the context. The same deflection, recycled. It's not just about protecting the past, it's about protecting the present. Because acknowledging what was done forces a harder question: who benefited from the silence? Who inherited stability built on someone else's disappearance? The ground feels less solid when you realize comfort has a cost, and someone else paid it. For many descendants, the hardest truth is that justice isn't coming. There will be no trials, no reparations that can touch what was taken, no apology loud enough to reach back through generations. What exists instead is responsibility, the burden of deciding whether to keep the silence or break it. Some choose to speak even when it fractures families. even when it costs them belonging. Others choose privacy, not out of shame but exhaustion. Both choices are understandable. Both are heavy. Because once you know, you can't unknow. The archive has been opened, and it's inside you now. They were born here. Their stories happened here, and the country that taught them to disappear now relies on their silence to stay comfortable. At the end of the archive, there is no grand reveal, no single document stamped confidential that explains everything. What you find instead is something far more unsettling, proof that this wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern, repeated often enough that it began to feel like tradition. Families born on this land learned that survival required compromise, that love required caution. That truth was dangerous in the wrong hands, and so America didn't just take lives, it reshaped them. It taught people how to shrink without disappearing completely, how to exist without leaving marks, how to pass as acceptable generation after generation. This is why the story feels unfinished, because it is. Descendants walk among us now, veterans, teachers, construction workers, engineers, fathers, grandfathers, men who carry a quiet gravity they can't explain, who feel anger rise without a clear target, who sense that something was stolen long before they were born, but left a debt they're still paying, not in money, but in tension, restraint, and silence. The land doesn't correct the record on its own. Houses don't confess. Courthouses don't apologize, and nations don't willingly indict their own myths. That work falls to individuals, often the ones least protected by the truth, the ones who risk being told to let it go, to stop digging, to stop making people uncomfortable. But discomfort is the point, because forgetting was never neutral. It was a choice. A decision made again and again, each time someone said, "That's not relevant anymore," or "That was a different time," as if time alone could absolve intent, as if distance could undo damage. They were born here, not as guests, not as accidents, but as people whose existence challenged the story America preferred to tell about itself. And rather than rewrite the story, the country chose to erase the characters. What you've heard tonight isn't meant to indict every generation, but it does demand honesty from this one. Because the archive is still open, the consequence is still active, and the silence still doing its work. If this story unsettled you, that's not a flaw in the telling. It's evidence that something buried is pressing back, wanting to be acknowledged, wanting to be named. Some truths don't ask permission to surface. They wait, patiently, beneath the soil.